Hey everyone, this is Turd Flinging Monkey, and I'm going to be updating my life history theory. I haven't really talked about this in probably coming up on a year. The reason being I had nothing to add to it. But I had an article sent to me that made a lot of things click, and I felt that it was time to update the theory. Now if you're fairly new to my channel, you don't know what I'm talking about. This is something I started fairly early on in my YouTube career. It used to be called the traditionalism cycle. And I've just been adding on to it, updating it, revising it. It's effectively a working theory. I'm kind of bringing everything together. I'm trying to make it as distilled as possible. So some of the changes have been, I've updated patriarchy to hard patriarchy to differentiate it from the soft patriarchy. I've added a color legend, so you can actually see, based on the color of the text, what this is talking about, whether it's political, economic, relational, or a trigger. I'll talk about triggers in a minute. But let me just define what I'm talking about. Political means the organization of the society. Economic, obviously, is talking about the economic issues, things like food production, reproduction, all that stuff. Relational is between men and women. So you can call this familial. I may change that in the future. Right now I'm just calling it relational. But I'm specifically talking about the relationships between men and women in a social context. And then the new one is trigger. And what do I mean by trigger? I'm talking about the thing that causes the triangle to turn. When you go from one angle to the other angle, there's a trigger event. And because the triangle has three sides, there are three separate triggering events. These occur at the points. This is when one system becomes another system. So what are these triggers? Well, right now we're in the feminism phase. What will cause feminism to turn and become a hard patriarchy is societal collapse. From a hard patriarchy to a soft patriarchy, the triggering event will be war and survival. From a soft patriarchy to feminism, the triggering event is loss of fear. Now perhaps trigger event isn't the right word, because these aren't like one moment in time where you can say that was when society collapsed. These aren't really so much moments in time as they are transitionary events. And to explain the top part, male disposability on one side and hypergamy on the other, this is to show to what extent men face these two pressures, regardless of the society. So in a hard patriarchy, male disposability is at a maximum. During a soft patriarchy, it's more or less balanced between male disposability and hypergamy. And under feminism, male disposability is slacked off a bit, but hypergamy takes off like a rocket. Now I'd like to talk about the article that more or less inspired this update. It comes from a New Zealand website called Stuff, and the article is called "In India's Nagaland, Men Are on Strike Until Women Return to the Kitchen," written by Amrit Dalian, February 19th, 2017. The article begins, quote, "Nothing ever happens in Nagaland, a predominantly Christian state tucked away amid hilly forests in India's northeast, on the border with Myanmar. But for a fortnight it was hogged with headlines because angry tribesmen, Nagas belongs to 17 main tribes, want to halt the march of history. They want women to stay at home and not enter public life. Naga women work at home and in the fields, men go to war, men make the decisions, that's Naga culture for centuries, we won't allow anyone to destroy our culture," says some guy I can't even begin to guess how his name is pronounced. Co-convener of the Joint Coordination Committee, JCC, which represents all the tribes. The violent protests that have paralyzed Nagaland over whether women can stand for election, hold office, and make decisions. The all-male tribal bodies are responsible for the social unrest which has seen strikes, the torching of government buildings, and 2 deaths. They have vowed not to let the government function until women are sent back to the kitchen." End quote, and that's all I'm going to read from the article. Now the reason why this created more or less an epiphany was I was struggling what could possibly prevent a soft patriarchy from slipping into gynocentric traditionalism and eventually feminism. Many argue that this is simply a natural byproduct of economic advancement. As you go from subsistence agriculture to an industrial economy, women are just going to get rights. They're simply going to take over. Hypergamy and gynocentrism are going to take over. And there's just no way to stop it unless you want to stay poor. And I reject that, not because it doesn't make sense, and not because it's not observable through history, but because it requires men's permission to do so. Men are the ones who gave women their rights. They could have easily said no. And it wasn't like going to the factory somehow caused men to want to give women rights. Gynocentrism can only exist at men's permission. So it can't be inevitable. What is it about men in certain environments which causes them to simply give in to females and destroy everything they built? What is the trigger which causes a soft patriarchy to descend into feminism? And if we understand that trigger, can we prevent that from happening? And I believe the Nagaland situation explains exactly how you can do it. Now, I want to be very careful explaining this. You need to understand that we are already in the feminism stage. We cannot move back to a soft patriarchy. We can only move forward into a hard patriarchy and then back to a soft patriarchy. So what I'm about to say does not apply to Western civilization. We are past the point of no return. However, after we get to a hard patriarchy and once we reestablish a soft patriarchy, these things will then apply in the future. A lot of things which seemingly don't make sense can be explained via fear. Why do feminists in Sweden hate and blame their own native male population for patriarchy, but then wear hijabs and bow down to Middle Eastern patriarchs? Fear. Why do feminists throughout Europe demonize men and masculinity, and yet remain silent when it comes to immigrant rape and violence? Fear. Fear is the answer. And I just want to point out that in Nagaland, this tribe that's extremely patriarchal and violent to try to preserve their culture are Christian. And yet here they are fighting for the patriarchy. How evil and barbaric. Now in the article, I'm not going to quote it, but it talks about how in the capital of India, feminists have actually imposed a 33% gender quota on representation in government. So when they have elections, they need to hold 33 seats just for women candidates. Men can't run for those seats. Now that's something that I don't even think a lot of Western countries have. That's completely cucked. And yet here's Nagaland. When the government told Nagaland they had to hold these seats, they just started rioting, and the government backed down. In fact, when the Constitution was written, they were so afraid of the men of Nagaland that they actually put a constitutional provision which allowed them to do whatever the hell they wanted. It even makes a note in the article that even the British dealt with them carefully because they were like headhunters and shit. If you want to know the secret to keeping the cucks, the manginas, and the white knights from overrunning you and destroying your culture and imposing feminism, it's a 4-letter word that's called fear. You have to understand that, the cucks, the manginas, the betas, they're weak. They always have been weak. That's why they are the way they are. They rely on goodness and compassion for men to basically lay down their arms and submit to the matriarchy. This is why they rely on shame and blame, because it works. I mean, look at this article. It's talking about how, these men of Nagaland are trying to resist history and how they're so terrible. They're just trying to preserve their culture. A culture which realistically is going to save them, where India just descends into feminism and collapse, as everything does. And the article closes where it's interviewing a Naga woman. And she's basically saying that, the government should come in and enforce the law because the Indian Constitution says women should have rights and they shouldn't let the men get in their way. So the women of Nagaland are not in the waltz. Just like that video clip I was showing of the Muslims in France, where the women basically are afraid of the men in their own community. And so when they were being interviewed by that French reporter, they were like hiding their face and they were like very concerned about their safety. The women in Nagaland are not in the waltz. They're not cut from a different cloth. They're just afraid of the men. They're begging the Indian government to come in and crush them, to give them the power. And this is what causes the downward slide into feminism. I talked about this in the coalition of egalitarianism. You have the cucks, the betas, the white knights, teaming up with the women to empower the women at the expense of the other men. And the only way to stop it is fear. It means you're going to have to be the bad guy. Just like Harvey Dent said, you can die a hero, or you could live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Now, again, I repeat myself, it's too late for the West. We can't impose this now, it's too late. The entire government is cucked top to bottom. All we can do is move forward into the collapse, into the hard patriarchy, eventually rebuild back into a soft patriarchy, but then we need to use fear to keep the cucks and the manginas from teaming up with the women and destroying everything we built. You have to embrace your inner asshole. You have to embrace the dark side. It's the only way that you can prevent your civilization from sliding into feminism and collapsing again. This is Turd Flinging Monkey. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.